Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at how we can add multiple components to an actor so that we can have multiple meshes and a more complicated actor that acts as a single unit when it comes to physics. Let's dive in and see how to do this. So now that we've got a decent looking level, let's look at putting together a little bit of a diorama for us to knock down. Now, you'll notice that when I dragged in this rack mesh, it created an actor but doesn't have any rack elements inside it. Now, you could go over to the content drawer and just cancel out the filter here by clicking on the filter button again and just hitting reset filters. Then going to the content folder, the industry props meshes, and looking for the actual rack item itself. I can drag that into the scene, but you'll notice I would have to very carefully position this. And what happens if I enable physics on both of these items? If I go ahead and hit play, you see that they kind of work. They kind of stick together to each other but then if you hit them, this kind of weirdness happens because they aren't cemented together as one single item. So if we want to make a single item out of multiple of these, what we need to look at doing is having multiple components. So when you select either one of these actors, you'll notice that they are actors that contain a single component, a static mesh component. We've seen this before. But you can have more than one of these static mesh components. You can add actually as many of them as you like. One of them has to be at the root of the actor, and the other ones will be children of it. And let's just have a look at what that means. If I first of all delete the rack actor that I brought into the scene, I'm going to open up my content drawer, and instead of dragging on to the viewport, I'm going to have my rack 1 selected, the vertical blue bars, and I'm going to select my rack 2 and drag it onto the static mesh component. And you can see it gets nested just underneath the first static mesh component. So that's what I mean by it is a child of that static mesh component. And what that means is that if we move the actor or the static mesh component, the rack will move with it. So the position of the rack, if you click on that rack component, you can see that the location is currently set to 0, 0, 0, but that's not true. It's not at 0, 0, 0 in the world. If I look at the rack says it's got a whole bunch of numbers, 1,000, 600, and even some offset from the ground. So why is this rack 3 within it showing something different? Well, that's because when you are a child of another component, your position is relative to the position of the parent. So if I were to move this component, if I select the rack 3 component and I move it up along the rack, then you can see that the only change to the location is that Z movement that I've added. And that gets applied along with the position of the parent in order to give us the overall position of that component, which is very handy because it automatically means that whenever we move the parent around, the child is going to move with it. And by the way, exactly the same thing holds if I were to rotate the parent, it also rotates the child. If I were to scale the parent, it also scales the child. But let's undo the scaling and rotation for now, because I'm quite happy with it as it is. So I'd like to challenge you to add another rack. The way we're going to do this is by adding a second child component to that actor. It's going to be a sibling of the first rack, but a child of those blue bars. And you need to enable physics on the root, so on the topmost static mesh component, and see what happens when you play. What happens now if we hit it with one of our ball bearings? Do we get any of that weird glitching? Okay, welcome back. So I'm going to do this one of two ways. So you could drag it in from the content drawer, Or you could select the rack component in the details pane and copy and paste it to get a second one. And you can see that these are now siblings. We've got a rack 3 and a rack 4, and we've got a root static mesh component. I keep calling this the root because the way this works with actors is that one of these components always has to be the root component. And it's actually the position of the root component that tells us the position of the actor. The actor doesn't have a separate position. It is only that position of the root component. So what we can do now is we can move this second rack up a little bit so that we've got a nice kind of layout here. And then what we can do is select that root static mesh component, select the physics category, make sure we've got simulate physics enabled, which we do already, or at least I do. The other two racks should have it disabled, so the two children should have it disabled. And if you go ahead and hit play now and launch a cannonball at this rack with a good aim, you can see that the whole thing has now been welded together and it moves as a single unit, which is much more as we want it to be. Great stuff. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in the next one.